the remarks that Marilyn has just made are very appropriate for me to follow on with. She was just talking about the logic of militarism. In a way, I want to talk about the psychology that's connected to that. To use the general theme that's been used by one of my heroes, Chomsky, he talks about the manufacture of consent and the necessary illusions we have. And so I want to refer to some of the aspects of that in this context. I mean, it's not obvious that we have a militarised culture in Australia, and I'm interested in the more subtle and more indirect ways in which we have this kind of militarisation and the idea of an enemy, which is exactly what Marilyn was talking about. Of course, we've had a succession of these things in the past. We've had, the Reds under the bed and the Yellow Peril. These were very significantly manufactured. In the case of the communist threat, of course, it was usually a case of national independence movements that were resisting our depredations around the world. And today, I think it's very similar. And these justify both our military adventures overseas and our enhanced surveillance at home, which we've heard about this morning. But I'm particularly interested in the core values that underlie these cases. And we see it often in the negative ways in which we describe something as being un-Australian. The question is, what exactly is the contrast? One question is, what could be more Australian than the ANZAC tradition that they always talk about and the idea of mateship? I think that's actually much more sinister and has a dark dimension than we generally realise. One of the symptoms of the dark and unfortunate side of that is that we assume that somehow the notion of mateship is uniquely Australian, and that's a prejudice and it's a kind of a racist assumption, as if other groups and other people don't have the same sense of bond and comradeship towards their own. One of the relevant questions at the moment, of course, is what do we imagine when we have these young Muslims, both from Australia and elsewhere, going to jihad elsewhere in the world? I think it's important to understand their motivations, and I think a very large part is what we would call mateship. It's a sense of injustice, and we assume it's some kind of irrationalist, fundamentalist, religious fanaticism, which I want to talk about. It's not that at all, and we would understand it better, and it would be important for us to understand it. Of course, we take ourselves in these cases to be the rational, decent, civilised people who've just devastated their countries in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. And we've given uncritical support to other so-called civilised countries like Israel who've just committed mass murder in Gaza. And we assume that we're the rational ones, and the people that stand in support of them are the fundamentalist crazies or the extremists. And of course, the question is often asked why they hate us, as if it's somehow mysterious. And of course, the usual slogan as part of this rhetoric is that they hate us for what we are, our freedom and stuff like that. And we're not allowed to think that perhaps it's what we've done to them, and we're not allowed to understand that. These are all part of what I take to be underlying the ANZAC spirit. A very problematic a kind of exceptionalism and in fact a form of racism. The idea, of course, is, and we saw it when John Howard was describing people who marched in Sydney, hundreds of thousands of people around the world, against the adventures in Iraq and elsewhere. And he described these as un-Australian. If you're not with us, you're against us and you're part of the enemy. The point of that is to say that dissent is somehow un-Australian. And that's very important. You remember in the film, I think it was Good Night and Good Luck, Ed Morrow's remark that not to confuse dissent with disloyalty, but that's standardly conflated for obvious political reasons. The idea, of course, is that independent thought must be prevented. Now, one of my favourite topics is this question of dissent, and because I teach philosophy, I'm interested in the way in which Socrates and Galileo and others are examples for us. Without going to the details of that, it's just important to mention that in the classic document of Western liberalism, John Stuart Mill referred to the cases, the historically significant cases. He mentioned the case of Jesus Christ and of Socrates as the examples in which dissent and independent thinking were, of course, ended in the death of those particular figures. But he made an important point that I wanted to repeat. I'll read the quote. He says, "These are exactly the occasions on which the men of one generation commit those dreadful mistakes which excite the astonishment and horror of posterity." But he made another important point. He said that the people who committed these crimes, as we now see them, were not the bad people of the time. He says they were not bad men, they were not worse than men commonly are, but rather the contrary, men who possessed in a full or somewhat more than full measure the religious, moral and patriotic feelings of their time. These were the people who were the respectable, decent folks who we now understood behaved badly. Now, I wanted to look at quickly in the time left in some contemporary versions of this. And the question that is familiar to us in Australia is our commitment to following sports and teams and so on, and we think it's innocuous. a rhetorical question is, do you feel good when, your football team wins a game or the country wins a game? And of course, people are hysterical. And in fact, I've never quite understood why people are in tears and sobbing when their side loses. I think this has a dark and pernicious side. We're supposed to be proud to be Australian, but what have you got a right to be proud about because somebody else wins a football game? Or for Don Bradman, what did you ever do that entitles you to be proud that Don Bradman did whatever he did? This is the kinds of feelings which I think seem to be innocuous, but I think they're very, very harmful. And it has to do, it's not an accident that Tony Abbott comes out and talks about Team Australia, using sport metaphors. This is really pernicious, and it means, of course, there's us and there's them. And the other team is somehow not really as good or as decent or as appropriate as we are. This is actually much studied by psychologists. I can't give you the full-blown lecture on this, but it's to do with in-group bias and what's called critical thinking. And these are the roots of patriotism and of nationalism, which are notorious for their harm that they've done. I can't go into the studies of these, but I'll just mention one example that's well known. There was a case in 1942, it's been much documented and discussed, of a police battalion, German police battalion, 500 men that were supposed to commit mass murder on civilians, men and women who were supposed to be shot. And the commander offered his troops to anybody who doesn't want to do this to step outside and there won't be any punishment. Out of 500 men, only 12 stepped aside not to commit these atrocities. When they were asked why, they got ill, some of them vomited and were horrified at what they had done. When they were asked why they didn't do it, is that they didn't want to step out of line from their comrades. They did it not because they had some ideological reason. They didn't want to be seen to abandon ranks with their friends. That's what we would call mateship. And it has a side that I think is really very harmful. I wanted to make reference to versions of these attitudes which are important. They're not the tabloid versions, not the versions you get from the shock jocks. I wanted to refer to the way in which this climate and what we call Islamophobia has been propagated by the highbrow, the intellectuals, the academics. I'm thinking of the atheists, the recently famous atheists like Sam Harris, who wrote a terrible book called Beyond Faith, I think it's called. And he's been cheered and regarded as a great hero for his courage by people that I otherwise admire for their other work, people like the philosopher Dan Dennett, whose work I know very well, and Christopher Hitchens, and of course Richard Dawkins. This is one of the most awful examples of the way in which we're brainwashed, and in this case at a highbrow level. I'll mention a couple of their examples so that you get the idea. These people hold themselves up as examples of scientific rationality and objectivity, and they care about the evidence. And it's an interesting study, I've written a bit about this. They show this quite pathological capacity to ignore overwhelming evidence that's contrary to their views. This is also a form of religious faith. It's a kind of state worship, religion of patriotism. And they're blind to the obvious examples that we'd be familiar with and I've mentioned. For example, people like Hitchens say that Islam is primary in explaining the rising tide of fanaticism and the cult of death. Well, you only have to know a little bit of history to understand who's guilty of the cult of death. We don't speak about what we do in those terms. But what's interesting is, and I can't go through all the detail, but one of them, I think Hitchens or Harris or one of them says, you should really listen to what bin Laden said. Well, one of the things he said was you should read a book by William Bloom called Rogue State. And Rogue State lists the 20 or 30 countries the United States has bombed, not to mention all the others that they've subverted and so on. That's what they were saying. And this gives you an interesting insight into what people like Hitchens and others would like to present as what they call the purely theological grievances of these people like bin Laden and others. This is terrible, and this is coming from not Alan Jones. This is coming from scientifically literate intellectuals. I mean, the facts are well enough known. I don't have to go through this, but it's worth mentioning. Just in Iraq, in the first Gulf War in 1991, most people don't know that the Americans, from the air, killed 350,000 Iraqis, of whom half, about 120,000, were civilians. Now, most people don't know this. There was a war crimes tribunal held by a former American Attorney General, Ramsey Clark. This is not understood, and so that's why this kind of nonsense can be spoken about the religious fundamentalists. By the way, I remembered I was talking before, and I wanted to mention one example of why it's not religious fundamentalism that we're against. A couple of these jihadists that went over to fight with their compatriots overseas somewhere, they checked their records and all the surveillance. They found what they had bought on Amazon, and they had bought Islam for Dummies and the Quran for Dummies. This is very significant because it tells you that they're not exactly motivated by their religious theological grievances. Harris says, for example, and this is, I'll try and wind up on this point if I may. it's really pathological, but Harris will say things like, we have attained, we in the West, the rational, civilized people, we have attained a higher level of social evolution and a higher stage of moral development. Yes, your reaction is exactly right. It's kind of nauseating. He concludes that it's Muslims that have a religious bloodlust who are standing eye deep in the red barbarity of 14th century violence. This is quite sickening. And he says, I'm quoting, these are not my words, he says, the very intuitions about what constitutes cruelty lags behind our own. Well, let me end on one note, referring back to Chomsky. During the Vietnam War, he wrote very eloquent, powerful pieces about our culture and the ways in which the manufacture of consent and the necessary illusions we suffer from. And in a society where such delusion and deceit can be received with widespread acclaim, here, it's impossible to avoid a dramatic question, a troubling question that he posed during the Vietnam War. He referred to, quote, the moral degeneration, which is on such a scale that we have to ask ourselves whether what is needed is dissent or denazification. Thank you.